Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Vintage Motocross Radio. I'm your host, Joe Abadi. Today's program is brought to you by Preston Petty Products. The legend continues. AMSOIL, the first in synthetic oil since 1973. Vintco, keep the ride going. And, of course, Vintage Motocross Q&A. Please watch our live show every Wednesday at 6 p.m. on Facebook. During today's broadcast, you'll see some slides across the screen, and I want to say that some of those pictures are courtesy of Todd Huffman, Terry Good, and Scott Heidbrink. My guest today was employed by Honda for over 40 years as a mechanic, a race team manager, and for 20 of those years, he worked in the R&D department in North America. As a mechanic during the golden age of motocross, he was a trusted wrench for such racers as Rick Staton, Bill Grossi, Bruce McDougall, Chuck Bauer, and Marty Smith. When Roger DeCoster departed from Suzuki, he became a rider for Honda in 1980. My guest this morning was Roger's mechanic throughout the 1980 GP season. It's my pleasure this morning to have with me on the phone Mr. Dave Arnold. Dave, are you with me?
Yes, I am, Joe. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure, Dave. And I'll tell you, the old saying was good things happen on a Honda. Apparently they really did for you, huh?
That's where I started and ended, and I had a lot of years with them. I think I worked for them for a total of 40 years, 20 years in racing and 20 years in research and development.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Dave, let's go back for a minute. I mean, not for a minute, for a real long way. How did you first become interested in motorcycles? When did that all happen?
I remember as a kid, I was bit by the bug. The older kids in the neighborhood, they were making hot rods and chopping things and drag racing, and actually our house was on next to some gravel pits where everybody was drag racing cars, and we'd run out there on our 20-inch bicycles. But, dirt track racing was pretty big. We would go to Whiteman Stadium in Ascot, and British bikes were probably the more popular bikes at the time, and we'd watch those guys go round and round and round. And so, I don't know, I really was fascinated with the whole, and then when motocross came, and when those guys, Torsten Hallman and Vickers and Joel and Roger came over and did the demonstration, whether it was Ascot or at Corriganville.
Right.
I went and watched that, but it was motocross was, I don't know, it was just fascinating to me. It was, it had, rough terrain, and it was kind of an athletic to some degree, and it was just interesting. It was just the whole mystique about, it was a European sport, but as it came to the state, it was really had a mystique about it for me.
Did you ride, Dave? Were you a racer at some point?
Yes, I did both those things. I mean, we all start out on 20-inch twin bicycles, and then we patched together a Taco mini bike, and then we're on an S90, and then we get 441 Victor BSAs, and finally I saved up enough for a 68cc 250, and I started to race quite a bit of motocross at Indian Dunes and Saddleback, occasionally Carlsbad, night races at Paris and Elsinore. So I raced quite a bit, more the intermediate class, and then turned expert right before I joined Honda.
Now, of course, you're very well known as being a mechanic. So when did that mechanical bug sort of hit? When you started racing on your own and you did your own wrenching?
I don't know. My dad was educated aerospace engineer, but there was 7 kids, but I ended up just being the mechanical one. I'd work on and interested in. We were building go-karts out of bed frames and lawnmower engines and mini bikes, and I was always kind of working on everybody's stuff in the neighborhood. I was just kind of the mechanical one as I grew up. Even with bicycles, I don't know if you've ever heard of upside-down bikes.
Sure. Yes.
We would flip the bikes. We were just out of control, and everything had to be modified, and it required changing the cranks over and putting on different seat stems and long bars, and we just did some crazy stuff. I made my own arc welder as a school project, and I remember we had a big trash barrel behind him. Both my parents were from the Midwest, from farms, but we had this big 60-gallon barrel full of old stationary engines behind the garage, and none of them had ran, and you have to take them all out. It was real oily and greasy and smelled like gas and oil. You take them out and try to take 3 engines apart and make one that worked, and we'd use that for the go-kart, get them running. I remember making a connecting rod, trying to make two engines into one, and all kinds of just crazy stuff.
Now the pieces all fall into place about why you are who you are, Dave. That's a really great story. I really find that so fascinating about people's early lives and how they how that road took them to where they got today. Now, if my math serves me correct, you were like 19 years old when you became a factory mechanic for Marty Smith in '75. And other than the experiences you just told me about, what professional experience did you have? And how did that job unfold for you to be a mechanic at Honda?
I was working on all my own stuff, but to be honest, I mean, my parents put a high value on, education after high school, and all my older brothers and sisters had to run off to Valley College or UCLA and start working on whatever their degrees. And I was more I was interested in motorcycles. I was fascinated with motorcycles. I was up in the hills every day, and I was more probably the shop class kind of guy and hands-on kind of guy. And so then I saw an ad in the back of Cycle News it was a motorcycle mechanics. It was a 2-year AS degree. It was at Trade Tech, so it was a tech school in downtown LA. So I signed up for that. It was kind of a deviation from all the 4-year academic thing, but my parents allowed me to get into that. And there was a couple of us that did pretty well in that environment. A lot of the guys coming back from Vietnam I think they got assistance from the government called the GA bill to go to school. And so, but, and there was a couple guys in there. Mark Porter, eventually, him and I became good friends. We would go racing together. He was more of a flat tracker. I was more of a motocrosser, and he ended up his whole career at Yamaha, and I ended up my whole career at Honda. But after trade school, I started working at Honda shops because, man, the Honda was making bikes and just exploding. And I was more of a British guy, probably because the dirt track stuff. I liked Triumphs. I had a BSA. Eventually, I had a Triumph. I just liked the styling and the sound and the feel and everything about the British bike. But Japanese bikes were becoming so prevalent with, they were making S90s and Trail 90s and, CL 350s and 450s and 500. And they came out with 4 cylinders. And so I just started working at Honda shops, mostly street bike stuff. And then the racing kind of took me to more of an off-road shop. Tom Sawyer Honda out in Canyon Country, and then eventually my instructor was still trying to get some of the top students placed at manufacturers. So Mark Porter interviewed and got hired at Yamaha, and I interviewed at Yamaha as well with Kenny Clark to be in the motocross team. They needed a mechanic for Mike Hartwig, and I didn't get that job. And then a few months after that, I interviewed at Honda, and I got that job to be a shop mechanic.
Do you remember who interviewed you and who actually hired you?
Yeah, at Honda?
Yeah.
Yeah, the interview was great. I just talked to the guy a few days ago, but it was Dennis Blanton and Steve Whitlock.
Oh, okay.
And I remember the interview. I mean, it's maybe what my skills and my background was and what they were looking for. And I think their team was, things were happening so quickly. I think the first American Nationals were actually in 74 and 75. And anyway, there was nobody at the shop. They showed me the race shop, and it was really kind of a converted, it was a garage, it was a wood building, and in any case, but they wanted to kind of get an idea of my mechanical aptitude, and so I remember part of the interview, they brought out a shoebox, and it was full of transmission gears, circlips and washers and gears, and there was 2 transmissions. One was for a CR, one was for an XL, because they actually were racing both engines. And I worked with that stuff almost every day, and so I could put them all together. Honda, I mean, they almost only go together one way properly. So I put them together. And then one thing we were doing at Tom Sawyer, because the transmission gear dog engagement wasn't very good, and so then the dogs would round out and the gears would round out kind of prematurely. So I said, you can make these things go a little bit longer, work a little bit better if you move the circlip over and you grind the circlip if you move the thrust washer to the other side of the gear. And they were impressed with all that, I guess. And they said, when can you start? So I remember that was the interview, and I always got a kick out of the shoebox full of gears.
Yeah. And, your next year, 1975, I guess you became Marty's mechanic. And I always found it interesting because, John Rosensteel was there. They won their first 125 national championship together. Honda is selling bikes as fast as they can make them. And you're out on the road there with the guy with the number 1 plate on the bike. I mean, what kind of pressure?
Yeah, that wasn't my first choice. I was forget the the sequence, but I think at the end of '75 there was a period of time where I worked on Billy Grossi's bike for maybe it was the end of the 250 Nationals.
Okay.
And then I worked on Rich Eierstadt's bikes after that, but I think after the Nationals in '75, John R. really didn't want to do the Trans Am series, so I ended up working on Marty's bike for the Trans Am. It's just kind of a casual thing because, working for Marty, Marty and I hit it off immediately. We were good friends, and he was fun, and the Americans weren't really expected to win the Trans AMA series, right? So for these 125 guys, I think Bob and Marty both rode that series. And Marty ended up winning 1 or 2 races, and Americans didn't beat the Europeans very often at all. I think at Kerman, Nebraska, Marty beat Roger. So, but anyway, then the following year, I think our Honda R&D came up with the scheme that they wanted Marty to race in Europe, and they came up with a plan to fly Marty back and forth. And John R., being the premier, his experienced mechanic that won both national championships, he was going to go to Europe, and then Marty wanted me to be the mechanic back in the States, and I was nervous as hell. I didn't really want to work on national number 1 bike. I didn't earn it. I was kind of the new guy there, and it was, I don't know. And then I remember a quote John R. made. He said, just keep the bike together, Marty, you'll do the rest. And as it started out, Hannah hit the scene, and their bike was really good starting off the season. Well, it was really good that year for the next few years.
Right.
And, we had bikes, we had parts that were breaking, and I don't know, we were really caught on our back foot for quite a while.
That RC 125, I always had a few questions, and you're one of the, I don't know, I guess you're like the only guy I could really ask about it. And there were 2 things. Number 1, was the head on that bike actually made of copper, Dave?
Yes, it was. I think that bike, Terry has one of the, Terry Good.
Yes.
Does this, working on this motocross museum project. Mm-hmm. He has one of the early prototypes that Taichi Yoshimura raced for. It was it was a works bike, but it was a prototype for future production, the 125 Elsinore. And that bike weighs something like 138, 140 pounds. And whatever the minimum weight limit was for AMA racing, our bikes were actually lighter than that. And I think, it was still an air-cooled bike. So an engineer came up with the idea, one way to cool the bike was to run a copper cylinder head that dissipate heat better than the aluminum. And then it's also putting the weight closer to the center of gravity. They felt it wasn't negatively going to affect handling as well. So, yeah, it was super heavy too. When you pick up the cylinder head, it's like, oh my God.
Ah, so it was copper. I often wondered about that. And there was one other thing about that bike. When you look at it in pictures, if you look just behind and above where the Kickstarter sits, there's a big hump in the case. Yes. And these days, fuel injection is not such a big, not that it's not a big deal, but it seems to be more of a commonplace. But here's Honda in 1974 with the possibility of running fuel injection on a 125.
Yeah.
Did you guys ever test that as a fuel injected bike?
No, it's possible. I heard from an engineer how that went, but honestly, I checked with the manager, since you and I had briefly touched on that, but I don't ever remember hearing the story about how that went or why they did it.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was just conception, something they wanted to try. But and I checked with John Rosensteel, and he was never, and also the manager at the time, Dennis Blank. Neither one of them remember testing that system in the United States, nor did they hear how it went in Japan. So I know that's what it was for, but all three of us never heard how it went. Must not have panned out.
Dave, what about the shocks on that bike? You know, they look a little like a Falta air shock or a little like a Fox air shock, but what was actually really going on there? Was it a coilover spring with air, or what was it?
You know, I believe, and I won't. Probably a show engineer is going to call me on this, but what I think it was an air shock. But the problem you had with air shocks was that, you know, there was a lot of stiction with a seal on a shaft that big, and I think the spring was used to counteract that. But I'm not positive. But yes, it was an air spring combination system.
Okay. Well, those were.
And I think, but you know, that was an era where, you know, even if you had the best air spring system, it took a few years for I think all of us, including some of the Japanese suspension component companies, Showa and KYB. But you know, I remember I remember some of the dyno sheets we got from Showa at the time. It would show, you know, compression at the different loads under the different shaft speeds, and it would go barely up to 1 meter a second. And they had a way to test shaft speeds higher than that. It was called a drop test, but still the speeds were relatively low. And it wasn't a few years after that I worked with Roger and Bruce Furness and Ken O'Leans, and they did a more accurate test out at Yucca Valley on actually they wanted to calculate what the actual speeds were for the fork and shock, and we were blown away to find out, you know, shaft speeds at that time were over 7 meters a second on the shock and over 11 on the fork. So there were other issues with some of that suspension. You know, I mean, I think at first the bikes were focused on being lightweight, and then later became long stroke and quality components. So.
Right. Huh. Hey, you know, you were obviously there at the golden age of Works Bike 70 through 85. And when it pertains to research, development, ideas going from concept to actually being put on a race bike, you once described it as warfare, Dave. Were there like spies and espionage? I mean, how did you keep these factory secrets from leaking out at Honda into the other hands?
I don't know. I mean, there was, I remember there being, the pace of development was very aggressive, and there was a lot at stake. I mean, there was a lot of bikes being sold in the 70s, so you had a lot of engineers trying to figure out what everybody else was doing, and, you know, there was cameras everywhere, and there was, you know, we knew some of the other, we were Honda, and we knew who some of the top Yamaha engineers were, and they were always looking at what you were bringing to the racetrack and taking pictures, and then they would have somebody stand next to the bike as you were rolling the bike to tech inspection, and he would have a tape measure or a scale sewn to the side of his pants standing next to your bike, and they're trying to take a picture and scale some of the geometry, the seat height, and suspension travel and wheelbase and fork angles, and you know, there was, and then they were rooting through trash cans trying to find gaskets and pistons you were throwing away, and just crazy stuff like that. We had an engineer, good friend Bruce Furness, working on some of Roger's stuff in Europe, and he's got one of the new O'Leans shocks apart. And we also had KYB engineers there working. I mean, the first single shock Honda was a big deal, and you know, so KYB was trying to develop their components, and Showa was trying to develop their components, and they'd be looking through the crack of the doors as he's pulling the shaft out of the body and seeing what the piston and valving looked like, and you know, I mean, there was a lot of friction. There was a lot of tension on people trying to keep whatever they were working on secret.
Yeah, I bet there was. And now, what about when you're at the track? I mean, at that point, you're in the pits and people are walking about freely. How is it there? I mean, are guys from Yamaha coming over and casually taking a look at your stuff, or how does that work?
Yeah, casually or aggressively. I mean, you know, everybody ribbons off their work area, but, you know, I think a lot of the Japanese, I mean, they're, you know, they got marching orders to get what they can get. And I remember one time there was, you know, one of the Yamaha engineers came into our pit area, and he was like touching or looking or taking pictures, and he was really close up to the bike, and he was in an area that was kind of bannered off, and Steve Whitlock was one of the Honda assistant managers, and he ended up grabbing him by the ear and marching him outside the banner. And I was like, oh, no, I don't think I would have done that. But in any case, it was, and some of the stuff, it was like racehorses. I remember when Suzuki was working on one of their first linkage bikes. It was a full floater, and they actually would have like blankets over the bike wherever they moved. If it went to tech inspection, if it went to the track, I mean, it was, they really kept things covered up to the best of their ability. So.
Let's move on to the 76 season, Dave. I mean, Marty was considered unbeatable at that point going into that season, but then Hangtown comes around, Yamaha shows up with Hanna, and they unveil a water-cooled 125. Had you heard anything about that OW before it was unveiled at Hangtown? And did you figure it was...
the bike?
Yeah, no, the Hanna's bike, the water-cooled bike. Did you hear about that before Hangtown? Did you know he was...
I may have heard. I don't think I went to quite as many local races, and the person I got a lot of information from was Warren Reed, because he was one of the, he was John R.'s stepson. He was very involved in a lot of the testing, and sometimes we would just give him a pair of shock. Go try this, go try these forks, and go try this cylinder, go try this pipe. But I think Warren Reed was talking about Bob, but gosh, there were so many riders at the time. I mean, I don't know that I probably didn't give Bob as much credit. I mean, I was focused on the bike anyway. That was my job, just to work on bikes and keep things together. And,
right.
And it wasn't until the actual race that kind of the reality of how fast Bob was and how good the bike was.
Now, at that point, are you thinking that the Type 1 bike that you have for that year is not going to be competitive against the OW? And are you hearing any rumors, or are you thinking about how you're going to make that bike better if a Type 2 doesn't show up?
I mean, I think there's a lot of pride and I won't say naivety. I think I was always, nervous of the competition. I don't think I ever, but I think within Honda, I mean, Honda sold a lot of bikes. If you look in the aftermarket, I mean, there was GGs and FMFs and TNMs and LOPs, and oh my God, it was like you would go to nationals and the qualifiers were just ridiculous. And so I think that, I was a bit surprised that, I mean, even when one of our riders, I remember when Billy Grossi signed with Suzuki. I mean, now looking back, and looking at a lot of the development that Yamaha and Suzuki both were doing in the Grand Prix in Europe, and the development of the monoshock, the development of the RM, and, gas shocks and offset forks and remote shocks and long travel. I mean, it's easier to look back and say, man, our stuff was light and fast, but, we didn't do nearly enough chassis and suspension development, compared to those companies in Europe at the Grand Prix tracks. And then when they finally did, it was a few years, and those developments were huge, when monoshock came, look at everybody that rode on that package, whether it was Burkett or Staten or, Mikola later. I mean, this is a few years later.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there was just waves of, and then the developments were really big with Honda. Then they were really big with Suzuki. Then they were really big with Yamaha. Then they were really, and we had our sparks of brilliance with Type 2s. And then all of a sudden, we were outclassed by somebody else, So it was just back to engineers spying on each other. I mean, technology was just leapfrogging, from one company to another company. And, of course, the top rider, in this case, Bob in 76. And they were just riding the wave of that technology, So.
Yes. Now, at Delta, Ohio in 76, you did get the Type 2, and you had only seen it, the day before the race, Dave? What was it like to get that bike and open up that crate and see that inside there?
The crates, I told Terry one time that, the bikes always smelled best, but they were packaged in, I don't know, maybe that's the wood they had to use in Japan, but they were just, I think it was mahogany, but man, it was just smelled so good. It was the same crate every time, whether we were crating bikes in in Gardena and Torrance at the Honda factory at the race shop, or out on the road. In this case, it was a hotel, but I do remember taking the bike out, getting it out, and it was a completely new generation,
Yeah, it was nothing like the first bike, and that was Marty's first outing on it. He had a little trouble in the first race where he got involved with a lapped rider and fell and finished 10th, but he ran away with the second moto. But there was some drama that ensued after that with a claiming thing, and it was all that claiming rule stuff going on at that time. Tell me about how close Honda was to losing the bike that day, and it was only the first day you had it.
Well, just real quick, I mean, I probably didn't elaborate. The bike itself was, the Type 2's Pierre Karshmakers was very instrumentally involved in the development of the Type 2, and he was in Japan, and those bikes went from concept from a blank piece of paper to a running prototype within 3 months.
Wow.
And at first it was, I don't know which was first. I believe the 400 was the first bike, and then there was 250s and 125s. I'm not sure of quite the order, but almost on top of each other. But, they went to revalve cylinders, more of a compact engine design to facilitate a long travel chassis layout. They had decarboned the gas shocks, which we hadn't had prior to that point. A stronger, more mass centralized frame and swing arm, and 4 larger tube diameters. And I mean, they were just fundamentally superior in every way to the Type 1. And, so then Marty, this is pretty late in the game. I'd have to go back and look at the series, but let's say it's mid-series. And Bob's been, in Yamaha, they've been, for the most part, having their way with Smitty and Honda.
Yeah.
And so then, from what I heard from Terry knew those guys. I think it was this guy, Bill Barlow. And, there was some talk about how exotic this new bike, and everybody's watching us uncrate it in the parking lot. All this speculation that it's better than Bob's bike, or at least it's far superior to whatever it is we've been racing for the first few races. And so it was apparently, I don't want to say having a couple drinks, but at nighttime it was Bill Barlow's, hearing all the kids talk about it. It was this guy's father. Yeah, I'm going to claim that bike, but he needed $2,500, which I don't know, and you had to have cash, not even just a check. And Terry told me that the promoter of the event, Paul Schlegel, he sort of walked into their pit, campfire camping arrangement.
Right.
And, got involved in the discussion. He goes, well, I'll just give you $2,500. I'll cash your check as soon as I get gate money. So he did that. And after the second moto, Bill runs over to the AMA. Ron Denny was the referee at the time and says, we're going to claim the bike and whatever form you have to fill out. And I remember Terry Could actually back then coming over and telling Marty. Now, I was cleaning the bike, and Marty's got the suntan and the long hair, and he's in his lawn chair, and he jumps up that his bike's going to be claimed, and he's all getting excited about it. And then there's this, I'm kind of blindsided. I mean, this just seems surreal that we get a good bike, and now we're competitive. I mean, Marty was leading the first moto until hitting a lapper, and then the second moto, I think, walked away with it.
Yeah.
And so then now the bike, here we only have it for a moto and a half. And then, so we walk over, long walk to kind of a tech area. There's a tower clubhouse. It was a hot, humid day. Ron Denny was kind of shaking like a leaf that this whole thing was going down. And I remember him sweating profusely. He was a bigger guy, and I felt bad. He had the shakes. He had a coffee can full of numbers, but there was Bill Barlow, who had claimed it. And then there was 7 other riders: Laporte, Jeff Jennings, Smitty, Billy Grossi, Glover. I forget all, but so there was a 1 in 8 chance of claiming the bike.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ron Denny's got a coffee can full of poker chips with numbers on it, and he goes, the low number gets the bike because there's 8 of you. And so then they go. Marty goes to Bill, you draw first. He's all PO'd that this guy's even trying to pull this off, So yeah. Bill Barlow pulls the first chip out. Well, it's number 43, which it's kind of a done deal at that point. That's a pretty high number.
Yeah.
And then Smitty pulls the second chip, and it was number 8. So then the bike went back to the Honda pits. But that kind of messed us up for the rest of the series, because as soon as the factory heard that their bike went away, they stopped us from racing it. They pulled the thing out of competition.
So you guys had to come up with another bike. Well, that's very interesting, because it kind of leads right into my next question. From what I understand, you and Donnie Emler put together an engine and put together a bike that if somebody, were to claim it, well, at least it wouldn't be factory technology. What did you and Emler do to make a competitive bike the next week?
Well, I think, I have to think back. Donnie and I, there was a couple projects that season. One of them was a production-based bike, and I think it was out, and I'm not sure if that's, and the other one was a Type 1, and I think after this race, we're talking about, I have to look at was it the very next week we're talking about?
Yeah, I think so, Dave, and I think it did go.
I think it was a production-based bike, and Donnie ended up doing an engine kit, and, I sort of did the chassis with all the Type 1 suspension parts on it. And to be honest, it didn't work out that well, and it probably was a great bike. And I know that Stevie Weiss, some of the guys on production bikes that, whether it be Warren Reed on his FMF bike or even Stevie Weiss, he was racing a production bike, and I think it was a Fox bike, but he had a tuner down in Texas. I mean, the guys that had worked on those bikes and the aftermarket had tuned those bikes, and they're racing those bikes locally, nationally, week in and week out, they were kind of in sync with whatever that package was. But all I know is when Marty tried to race, it sounded like a good plan, but when Marty tried to race that bike the following week, we were kind of a fish out of water. It just wasn't set up very well.
But then Yamaha had to take off their hot water cooling deal too, though, didn't they? I mean, everybody had to take it down a notch.
I think Yamaha made a much less drastic move than Honda. I mean, Honda, we overreacted in hindsight. And I think Yamaha, okay, so we're going to take off the water cooling and just run an air-cooled engine. But it was essentially the same bike, right?
Yeah.
I think it kept Bob more in the ballpark of, what he was racing. Maybe it didn't make quite as much power with being air-cooled, but I think for us to completely upset the apple cart was an injustice to Marty and the championship.
Yeah. Just a moment ago, you mentioned about a bike going from concept to being on the track, Pierre Karsmarker's being in Japan and developing that bike. Tell me about some things you remember. Did you go to Japan to help develop anything? And by the time... Go ahead.
I may have gone a couple times in the 70s, but honestly, I don't remember development being a very structured, full-time process in the 70s. It was kind of went from one group to another group. I remember one year it would be Honda R&D, but it was almost like you put a bunch of your production engineers on this project, and then they come up with something exotic, and then they run off and build it. And there were some miraculous things that came out, but it wasn't a full-time group that was also in Europe at the Grand Prix tracks, that was also in the States. I mean, we didn't have engineers, we had them occasionally, but we didn't have engineers full-time. We had to do race reports, but it was kind of a disjointed system, in my opinion, looking back. And, so I would say when Roger, so I know Pierre, when Honda hired Pierre, it was after actually Honda tried to hire DeCoster. That was right around the time I got hired. And there was a bunch of open bikes in the shop. There was, because Roger was a 500 GP world champion at the time. And so then Honda had a short and a long stroke 380 and a short and long stroke 400. And I had heard that, before Roger signed his next Suzuki contract, they had Roger secretly go out and try all these things. And Roger said that there was something about each one of them that he liked, but there wasn't one bike that seemed very refined or complete as a package. But in any case, they hired Pierre because they wanted to develop this new generation. And Pierre was in Japan. I don't think I made very many trips to Japan during the 70s until later in the 70s, but maybe I did one or two.
Right.
But when they hired Roger in '79, from that point on, I was in Japan multiple times a year working with engineers at the factory. We did races in Japan in the '80s. More like they had a. Well, I think Marty did a couple things at Suzuka Circuit, racing Tofukuji and some of the top Japanese riders at the time nationally. He went over there a couple times, but in the '80s we were there. Supercross was going crazy, and Japan wanted to have a Supercross, and they wanted to have it out. We were there, Japan, racing 2 or 3 times a year at the end of the season, and during those trips, we'd be meeting with engineers about how things are going and what we need going forward.
Alan Wise, a friend of yours and just an acquaintance of mine from Facebook, Alan Wise, brought up an interesting bike and an interesting time. Marty wraps up the 77 500cc National Championship. Then Honda comes out with an RC 450 that he didn't like as much as the 400. And you did some things, and you built a special bike for him based on an RC 250. Do you remember what you did with that bike, Dave, and how that all came together?
Yes, I did. We tried a lot of curveball things back at the time, and the one thing back to your comment is, even at the end of '75, I mean, Marty being purely a 125 guy, nationally winning 74 and 75 championship, but even the Trans Am, for him to be competitive at the top level, but it was on a long stroke 400cc. It was a Type 1 with a black motor.
Yeah.
But he liked that bike, and he went fast. It was before the next generation, the Type 2, the Pierre influenced and all that. And but even, as that engine got developed, the Type 2s, the engine's a little bit more compact, the countershaft a little closer to swing arm pivot, but essentially same bore and stroke, but it was still a 5-speed. We had longer travel, the Type 2s. I mean, that's the bike. Marty raced it a couple times in '76. In '77, we won the national championship on it. But Honda also, forget what year exactly Brad Lackey started with Honda for the GP series. But
78, I think.
70, huh?
78, I think, Dave.
78, right?
Yeah.
So Brad, I think Europeans just rode differently than the Americans. The Europeans shifted less. They rolled, the style of racing over there was to be smooth and get traction and roll the power on. And if you ever watched, I remember when Marty did beat DeCoster in the Trans Am in Nebraska in '75, I remember Roger coming over and congratulating us, which I was kind of scared. I go, man, I didn't know if he was going to beat me up or what. I knew Roger, but we didn't talk much.
Right.
And he came over, but then an American, somebody like Marty. Marty was a likable guy and a respectable competitor. And
sure.
He congratulated Marty. He congratulated me. But he made a comment. He goes, I have never raced with guys that hold 400 or 500cc two-strokes wide open and fan the clutch in the corners. And that's kind of the way Bob and Marty, coming from 125s, that's the way they rode open class two-strokes, was more like their 125. And I would say that Brad in Europe, he wanted larger displacement, more torque, and less transmission speed. So they developed a 450 4-speed, and Marty didn't get along with that bike at all. I mean, it didn't rev. It didn't allow him to ride the same way. And also, you got longer stroke, bigger bore. You need more flywheel. Then the bike probably physically was a little heavier, but the inertia, the crankshaft makes it feel quite a bit heavier, so it's
sure.
less maneuverable. And so Marty didn't like the bike, and he asked me I don't know why the 400 was not available at this point in time, so I built an RC 250, but I put an aftermarket. Mugen was making big bore kits for 250s. It was a 360, and so I put something like that together. But to be honest, that it was a fun bike to ride, but it was no match for open class 2 strokes. And I remember racing the bike at Carlsbad. Marty raced it at Carlsbad, and it just wasn't fast enough. So we did a lot of crazy and that was one that didn't work out. Some did. So.
And the factory didn't have a problem with you trying to make that bike work? I mean, some factories don't want you changing stuff, you know.
I would say we weren't. They were reluctantly flexible.
I see.
Is the best way I can put it, because I don't believe there was really full. Of course, if it came with a new bike and engineer accompanying the bike, you know, then of course you didn't mess with it. But then, you know, a lot of times during the 70s, we were kind of out, you know, traveling the country, fending for ourselves. And if the bikes didn't work, you know, I remember a period of time when the show was suspended. There was a period of time when we went from show suspension to air shocks around 77 and 78, right? And I know Fox did really well selling air shocks. They happened to work better than any of the show as Japanese components, you know, for a couple of years. And then it was really, at the end of the day, when tracks got rougher, no match for what Suzuki was doing with KYB, with remote reservoir, kind of that European Koni, Olean, decarbone. You know, it was really a superior design for heat management, controlling shock fade and valving, and, you know, all the things you need for suspension. And so then, so then I started testing with Oleans. But a lot of times the factory wasn't around to, you know, they weren't around when you put Fox shocks on the bikes, and they weren't around when you put Olean shocks on the bikes. And a lot of times, you know, even testing these things, you know, it wasn't until Roger came to the team that I think we were really structured enough to even know how to prepare. I was blown away how much Roger prepared for racing, like how much testing, different tracks every day. I mean, it was, I don't remember. I mean, I remember Marty Smith saying the bike wasn't good enough and just go out, Dave, you ride, because he knew I rode. Not like he rode, but he was saying, just do whatever you think and it'll be okay, because he wanted to race back to San Diego, you know. And I don't know if that was really a way to prepare for, you know, national and international level competition.
In 1980, Dave, you actually went to live with Roger. I mean, he had left Suzuki, went to, of course, you know, came with you guys on Honda. You go to live with him in Belgium. You work together with him preparing his factory bike for his GPs that year. And, you know, I mean, I had heard, too, he was quite an accomplished machinist. He could run a lathe. And he was going wide open 24 hours a day to get bikes the way he wanted them. What's that like? I mean, when I think about like 7 or 8 years before, you're in the pits with Roger, but you don't know him that well. Marty beats him at a race one day. He comes over and you're not sure what he's going to say. And then here it is 7 years later, you're living in Belgium with Roger de Coster. You're his mechanic in the twilight of his career. What's a typical week like living with Roger in Belgium, preparing for a GP?
I idolized. I mean, I don't want to, you know, make this worship stuff, but I mean, I idolized de Coster. I mean, I idolized what he represented. You know, I mean, the Europeans coming, bringing the sport to America, really kind of showing the Americans the style and the fitness and the preparation and the development, and a lot of these, you know, guys like Roger. I mean, they were beyond a racer. I mean, he was a diplomat for the sport, and then you mentioned he was a machine. He was also a machinist. So he was in the shop with me, working late at night. You know, we need parts built, and I fabricated quite a few things. But here he was making axles, and I'm like, 1 and 2 in the morning. I'd come back from dinner, and we still work for 3, 4 more hours. And I'm like, this is not normal, you know. And then we'd be out the next day testing, and so I mean, what it was like. Marty had the Marty Honda thing was coming apart a little bit. Partially, I guess. I think Marty's competitiveness after his injury was really difficult. I mean, Marty was naturally talented and focused and really good at what he did, but the level of pain, it was a big deal when he broke his hip, and you know, and so then you had Honda wanting this big effort starting 80, 81, 82, and you know, they hired Roger you had to be a top racer, but to help mentor the other up-and-coming European riders on Hondas, Graham Noyce, and Andre Malher, but to also help them, mainly to help them develop the equipment, because he was kind of known as a development rider. And
Yeah.
it was for that reason, one, Marty wasn't going to be with American Honda anymore. Two, we were at this test at the late 79, and it was the first Pro Links, and it was 1 week every different track. We were up in Santa Maria for days, and we were at Carlsbad for days. And I know a good friend of mine, Bruce Furness, was working with Roger and Ken O'Lean on a new. Roger kind of wanted to hedge his bet on, European suspension manufacturer. I think he believed that they were technically ahead of most where the Japanese were.
Yeah.
And so Kent and Roger and Bruce were working on a new shock design, single shock for, the future Pro Link Hondas. And I just wanted to be a part of it. And I knew Roger, and Bruce said, well, he wasn't sure what Roger's current mechanic, Eula, was going to be doing, but he thought I should approach Roger. And I was nervous to do so, but it was the very last day, probably the very last hour, and testing was done, and I jumped in the back of his truck at Carlsbad, and I said, hey, I don't really know what your plans are for next year, but I'll do anything to go to Europe. And it was a big deal for Americans to go to Europe. The Grand Prix were the premier form of racing. That's really where the development, that's where, there was the other American mechanics that were trying to make their way over to Europe. That were interested in the hardware and the technology and the development and things like that, and even the culture and even the tracks and even the riders.
Mm-hmm.
So, Roger said he'd get back to me, that he wasn't sure what his mechanic was going to be doing, and he got back and we made an agreement. He said it was going to be hard and a lot of work, and for the first few months, he'd prepare a loft at his house in Tremelo, Belgium, outside of Brussels. And I lived with him, and we were going to be testing a lot, traveling a lot, and I didn't care, whatever. I had a wife and child, but whatever it took, I was all in on this deal, and it was one of my favorite memories in racing for the 40-year period.
Were your wife and child there with you in Belgium?
Not originally. And neither was his. In the beginning, it was just me living with him, and us we were going back and forth to Sweden, working with Kent O'Lean and Bruce with, the shock development and testing up in Sweden. And we were out there was probably 15 tracks in Belgium at the time, and we went to all of them. It seemed like every week, but obviously not. And we went up into Austria. He did some national races in Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Czechoslovakia, Holland. Before we ever started the Grand Prix, trying to make sure things were sorted away. But
sure.
There was no distractions. There was no cell phones. There was no computers. There was, it was wake up in the morning, grab breakfast, which was just, the local, in Europe, everything's fresh. You go to the bakery, you get your jam and butter and coffee, and it's pretty simple, right?
Yes.
You start working on bikes, you clean bikes. He had a friend, Roger Vandenborg, ended up working for Honda for quite a few years himself, but he helped me quite a bit. There was so much back then with the different currencies and traveling to different countries, and when you crossed the border, you had to have a carnet for all your equipment showing, what was going in and out of your country and things like that. So it was quite a bit different than traveling nationally in the States.
Sure. Now, in that year, now that I'm thinking about it, it's 1980, and Andre Malher was on Honda as well. He's obviously from Belgium. Roger's in the twilight of his career. You think Roger was somewhat of a mentor to Malher, or
no? Not somewhat. Roger, from what I witnessed, Roger was there to race, but but his role was to develop the bikes, and his role was to work with upcoming guys. And I would say that what I witnessed when I was in Europe for the Grand Prix, there is a lot of nationalism.
Yes.
There was borders, and the Swedes would hang out. There was all these cliques at the races, the English guys, the Belgian guys, and the German guys. There was, it was all kind of divided up in these cliques. The Swedes had their clogs and their very white skin, the very blonde hair, and they had the Copenhagen in the back pocket, and then the English. And so I would say that Noyce, whether it was nationalism or I don't know what, but I don't think he utilized Roger in the same way Andre Malher plugged in to Roger. Roger was very much a mentor to Andre winning the world championship. I mean, Andre was the nicest guy, but he was all in. I mean, it wasn't like, I'm going to take what you say and filter it and use what's appropriate. I mean, Andre was, Roger was a huge asset, and he was going to use it.
And he listened to everything Roger said.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
100%. He appreciated it, he utilized it. Whatever knowledge, whether it was bike, whether it was setup, with race, tactics, and obviously they're speaking, Flemish or French. I think Andre was more the French side of Belgium.
Yeah.
But Roger spoke both. Roger speaks 5 or 6 languages fluently, they were. And Andre was such a nice guy. Bruce and I, if we went to the other side of Belgium to go testing with Andre, he would go out of his way to make sure you were comfortable at your hotel, and here you can have his car, and just the most appreciative guy,
Yeah.
So.
Were you also developing the Pro Link at that point, Dave?
I'm sorry, say that again.
The Pro Link, were you guys developing that in Belgium at that time, in that year?
Yeah. We were, yes. The first Pro Links, not to make it a big history thing, but the first Pro Links, there's not very much room to package all that stuff in front of the rear tire, behind the swing arm pivot, given the length of the swing arm, and given the room the shock has and the linkage has, coinciding with the airbox. And in the first systems that were tried were very high leverage, and spring rates, shock stroke was like 85, 90 millimeters, and spring rates were like 12 kilogram or so. And then, then there were systems that I think we had going into that season that were a little bit less leverage, so spring rates were. Roger wanted the Pro Link, the character of the Pro Link, to be more progressive. And early on, when he was riding the bikes from the end of '79, we started working on an alternate system that was more progressive, that had more shock stroke and lighter spring rates. And I was at machine shops, bandsawing parts and fabbing parts and making, the linkage has a triangle and a connecting rod, right? And then
Yes.
It required a different shock length, required different stroke. I think it went to like 105 stroke, or close to 100 anyway. And so spring rates went down. And so we were doing that even pre-Grand Prix season, testing in Belgium. And before we went to national races, we were working on an alternate Pro Link system. Andre, I think everybody used it. I think everybody converted to it. I won't swear to that. Maybe Chuck sent in the state, I think, and Graham Noyce. Andre for sure. Everybody sort of evolved to this new system Roger, Bruce, Kent, and I were working on.
So, you guys really were hands-on. Roger himself was hands-on with the development of a Pro Link. I think that's absolutely fascinating. I think that's just absolutely fascinating. And
very. And we had knock on wood, we had a very productive relationship with engineers in Japan. There was, the guy that hired Roger, Mr. Miyakoshi, he's one of the original founders of two-stroke, motocross bikes at Honda.
Yeah.
And under Soshiro, so there was no bureaucracy like there is today. Some of that's good, some of it's probably bad. But one thing I remember clearly was that, Honda R&D, or let's just say engineering, it acted separate from all this corporate structure. So even though racing in America was under sales and marketing, we were talking about technical things. We were developing future model and, new technologies. And, there was very down to earth, even though, we didn't speak fluent Japanese, nor the engineers speak fluent English or French or Flemish.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we had a lot of mutual respect and a lot of influence on development over the next 10 to 15 years.
Dave, you were a staple at Honda for so many years. It's even uncomfortable me. Not that it's uncomfortable for me to ask the question, but after hearing or discussing with you so much throughout this interview, at some point you must have been offered a job with another team. Did you ever consider leaving Honda, and did you ever get another offer that you passed on?
I don't think I ever came off like I was looking. I mean,
yeah.
I think that I don't know. There was you end up with a bunch of personal relationships.
Yes.
They treat you relatively well. They put a lot of pressure on you as well. But you were a part of a bigger picture at that point in time, and I think there's a sense of family. I think there's a sense of loyalty, and you can always look back at your career. I've heard Roger do the same thing, like, "Oh, I should have played this, and I should have gotten more financial compensation," or you know what I mean. But I don't know. I think because they allowed Honda the company. I think because I met Soichiro Honda on a few multiple occasions and
mm-hmm.
worked with his top engineers, and Mr. Honda was not he was not a formally educated guy, and he was actually kind of skeptical about, or he would challenge some of that pure theoretical, engineering. And I think he allowed people like me, go back to my education. I was a trade school guy, but he allowed me to, if you were hands-on and you learned on the job, he would allow you to have relationships with his engineers at the highest levels, and you kind of grew within that. And I think because of that, I just wasn't really interested in much of anything else. You were interested in, I think you got pretty, people would say things about, your bloodline or something like that. But
yeah.
It got very competitive. Plus it's very competitive to the other companies. It wasn't like, some people got hired away, and there was kind of a code in the 70s that you would not hire another number one's rider. So if you didn't earn the championship, it didn't always hold true, and Honda broke that agreement later on in a few occasions. But it was unethical to hire somebody else's number one rider, and it was unethical to hire somebody else's managers or engineers or mechanics to some degree.
Yeah. And Dave, what year were you promoted to be a team manager? 81, I think it was?
Yes, end of 80.
End of 80. So it was going into 81, and we were it was a little touch and go with the Motocross the Nations team at that time, but Roger jumped in there and insisted they put a team together.
Well, I'll say, just even touch and go, it was touch and go with the guys that hired me, because my first job was to hire Mark Barnett. They wanted to hit the ground running, and Barnett was the dominant guy.
Okay.
And so, Barnett, he was open. My first job was to hire him, and we had a verbal agreement. And then Suzuki brought Mark back in there and got nervous. Honda was going to take him away, and they paid him a bunch of money, and he stayed there. And so then, the guys that hired me right out of the gate, they weren't very impressed. And they had a bunch of things that they were working on in Japan, and maybe even for the Grand Prix riders. But in the U.S., it's almost like Cliff White and I and a couple of the other mechanics at home. They sent us bikes, but they didn't really think that some of the riders we had there, very local, Southern California, Donnie Hansen and Johnny O'Mara, and they weren't the premier guys in the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. So what was Japan doing? What is it you were going to do? Even if they did a lot of work, they didn't see you winning championships, and that's kind of the reality starting off in 81. But we tested, and in the States, we worked on bikes, and we had some water-cooled bikes, but there was some good things about them and some bad things. And we made some hybrids that kind of had air-cooled ergonomics and gas tanks and lowered radiators, and we developed bikes that Donnie Hansen, halfway through the 250 Nationals in 81, he started to be, Hannah and whoever else, Barnett, and Glover and all those guys, and then in the end of '81, I remember Roger got a call. I don't know if the first call was from Arthur Cohen, the Bel-Ray guy, or Dick Miller, probably Dick Miller. Well, the magazine guys were frustrated that the AMA was I think they made a statement that they weren't going to send a team to Motocross the Nations because they hadn't won. Americans didn't have a snowball's chance in hell of winning, and the Americans couldn't work together. They all hated each other. There was all this. Bob, would create friction with Howerton and, with Tony DiStefano or Brock Glover. I mean, nobody liked anyone, right? They certainly had a hard time being on the same team for the same concept goal.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think Dick Miller's called Roger. Can't you guys put together a team? So Roger hit me up with it, and I'll say yes to anything, and I did. I jumped. Yeah, that'd be awesome. That'd be great. In the back of my mind, I had been to Europe and I had seen Andre Vromans and the world champions over there ride in the roughest tracks. I'd never seen tracks like this in the States.
Yeah.
And I go, we do not have a snowball's chance in hell in pulling this off. But I'm all in. It'll be a great experience, and then the rest is history. But I was in the back of my mind very apprehensive that we could pull that off.
So, everything goes pretty smoothly over those couple of months of putting the team together? It just, everything fell into place?
Yeah, I mean, there was details of, behind the scene. I mean, I was more of the general, like, hey, they say go bomb those guys or go invade that country. And I was kind of like, somebody told me to do something, and, I said, I had some latitude as to how it would be done, and I put together, I'd have meetings and get everybody to prepare the equipment, and it was huge, the amount of equipment. We had to fill up L8, I think, these huge containers, spare wheels, spare engines. It wasn't even 4 bikes. I think we would have spare chassis, spare suspension. I mean, we sent so much equipment over there. We had to be there for a couple weeks.
Yes.
And then we had to race 250 and then race 500s. And so, I came up with this goofy idea. I get all patriotic, and I thought, well, let's make a team jersey. Now, everybody has different clothing companies, at least 2, maybe 3. But I'd like to have an American flag. It's a big Honda H. And so we got everybody to kind of cooperate to do that because it was it was the American team. It wasn't really an individual thing. It was. I mean, there was behind the scene. There was quite a bit of who was going to pay for it. I think Honda. The magazines. I think Dick Miller and whoever else was working, and I think even Arthur Cohen in Europe. He got the hotel to help with rooms and things like that. I think we stayed at the Crest Hotel in Amsterdam.
Right.
And but yeah, I mean, those guys worked out all the details, and I just got on the plane when they told me to get on the plane.
Dave, with all the research I've been doing and listening to other interviews with you and Steve Mathis and so much, it was incredible. Well, it's not really incredible. It speaks volumes about how much of a team player you really are with Honda. And I've got to jump forward here a little bit in time. You're such a team player, but there was a serious thing. You had to make a big decision. 1990, Budge Creek, there's a championship on the line, and you benched perhaps one of Honda's most successful racers ever. Tell us what went down that day.
Well, so,
am I throwing you a curve here, Dave? You need a little help? I'll help you out.
No, I remember what it was.
Okay.
So the background to that was Jean-Michel Bale, French guy. I think that's who you're talking about, correct? I
am, yes.
So the background to that was later in the 80s, Jean-Michel, Jeff Stanton, there was a Supercross championship. Mm-hmm. And we had 2 guys that were in the hunt. It was Jeff Stanton and Jean-Michel Bale, and then Damon Bradshaw. So there was 2 amateurs. I'd have to say that was I'm trying to think, it was maybe even 89. It might have been 90, but 80. So it came down to a final round at the LA Coliseum, but the two guys that came out of amateur, it was Jeff Matasevich and David Bradshaw. Well, these guys, they were talented, and they had a whole different style about them. They were a bit cocky, and they would slam the established guys. And I mean, racing, you don't have to put out a red carpet for a guy in the corner. But these guys were kind of riding with, hey, it's the new world order, and you guys just, kind of get out of the way. And Bradshaw was very talented. Yamaha had been grooming him for years through amateur racing, and now he's transitioned to professional racing. And Yamaha had not won many championships during the course of Honda getting serious about racing throughout the 80s.
Yeah.
So I know Yamaha made a super big deal about that race at the LA Coliseum, the final round. And they had semi-trucks full of promotional material and all the dealers. And, they were leading the points by, I'm going to guess, 5 points or so, or 6 points. I think it was 6. And Damon was the odds-on favorite to win. He was actually probably a bit faster than Stanton, but anything can happen in racing. And so came down to the final round. Well, and I should back up one race. So Stanton and Bale were pretty close in points, trailing Bradshaw. But Bale got knocked off the track at San Jose the week prior to the LA Coliseum. So then going into the Coliseum race, he wanted to blame Jeff Stanton for that. And, there's no way he was going to help another teammate, Jeff Stanton, win the championship. So, in fact, Jean-Michel Bale did his best to ride against Stanton at that race and try to help Damon, who had nerve issues. He sort of got tense, and I don't know people that watched the race. I mean, Damon had a hard time riding at the front of the field. He was stuck back in the pack, and there was, Jean-Michel Bale was waiting for him and trying to help him and riding behind him, riding in front of him, and so he was basically a team member riding against the team.
Yeah.
So flash forward to the race you're talking about. Jean-Michel Bale was a 125 world champion prior to this time, a 250 world champion, comes to the States. Now he had won 250 Supercross Championship, 250, the 250 Nationals, 500 Nationals. The only championship he hadn't won in motocross worldwide was 125 Nationals.
Right.
And he'd already made a statement that he wanted to move to road racing at the end of that season. So, which he ended up, I hope this makes sense, but going into that race, he had gotten injured, and he was now out of the points. So the championship came down to Kudrowski and Cooper, I believe.
Yes.
I knew for a fact, because I knew Jean-Michel Bale, he was not going to help Mike Honda or Kudrowski or anybody but Jean-Michel Bale win that championship based on the way he rode against Stanton at the LA Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not, this whole thing about riders riding for the team and it being a team sport. I mean, short of somebody going onto the track saying "Let Brock by" or something. I mean, look at the way Roger with Dungey and with Jason Anderson. I mean, there's a way you can ride for the team, which
sure.
is, without being dirty and taking somebody else out. But and you don't really do that all season long. It's a very individual sport. But when it comes down to it, there has to be some advantage to having a manager like Roger and a team member like a Jason helping a Dungey or vice versa. So it was merely that. And when Jean-Michel Bale was in Europe, injured, it wasn't like we had phones or the internet. I was asking how things are going. Are you okay? When are you going to be back? And then those questions I could get answered. But, I'm going to need your help because of the points. It comes down to these two guys. I need to know when you do come back, I can rely on you. And Jean-Michel Bale wasn't going to confirm that, and he certainly wasn't going to do that. So when he finally showed up at Budds Creek, it was finally the morning of the event. I jumped in the back of his truck and had that same conversation. And he goes, sorry about that.
That's okay, Dave.
He said, it's never going to come down to that. I said, you're probably right. But if it does, I need to know, your loyalty, your allegiance is this. And he goes, it's never going to come down to that. And I said, okay, let's hope it doesn't. But if it does, can I rely on you? And he says, you can't ask me to do that. And I said, then you're not racing. He won't do it. Then I go, you're not racing today. I can't take that chance. I couldn't take the chance of him riding against the team like he rode against Jeff Stanton at the LA Coliseum. So, man, then the rest of the day was with the French press. They were, I forget, Xavier or somebody else. They were like, Dave, but that's asking Jean-Michel, another Frenchman, to eat shit.
Yeah.
And I'm like, exactly. That's what we have to do when somebody's paying us to do a job. That's sometimes part of the job, And,
yeah.
So.
Well, it was a tough decision, and but you did it, and hey, that's the way the cookie crumbles, as they say, right?
Yes, that's what they say. Jean-Michel, let bygones be by. We're good friends. He came up to me in later years, told me I did the right thing, and we had our arms around each other. So.
Oh, okay. Well, vive la France, as they say.
Yeah.
Dave. Hey, of all the wins you had at Honda, what do you think the most gratifying one was of all of them?
That's. I made a list because.
Yeah.
I knew you're.
You had a feeling I was going to ask that, huh?
I'm not going to go through them all, but starting with Marty in '77, but 500 nationals, but we got a little bit lucky, and then Roger in '80 went in his last race at Luxembourg, which he should have won the previous week in Namur.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that would have been, but that was big. 81 to Nations it's hard. That was like super. Almost not expected, such a big deal, such a bad news bearer, underdog, turn hero kind of a thing. So that has to be, if that's not it, 82, when Chandler won all 4 motos, then later the same year when Chandler won Superbikers, Chandler and Stevie Weiss.
Right.
86, Honda won all championships worldwide. We won the Supercross title, 1, 2, and 4, I believe, in the States, and then we won all the nationals. Stanton stepping up in '89, Bale in 90-91, putting the peak team together with Mitch Payton in '92, McGrath in '93. Then I worked with Tomac after that. After I retired from Honda, I worked with the Geico guys. I don't know. I'd have to almost say if I had to pick one.
Yeah, if you could.
When the Americans beat the Europeans at 81 to Nations.
Yeah. I don't think anybody could argue with that, Dave. Hey,
that was just such a. I remember Roger and I. We didn't. Now they have software that tells you real time who's doing what. Back then we were scrambling and trying to figure out. And I remember we were in front of the snow fence, and it might have been at Lommel Sand Track in Holland.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody likes to drink beer in Belgium and Holland, And so there was a bunch of spectators, and so they were yelling at us to get out of the way. They couldn't. Roger and I were crouching down and say, "Hey," they're speaking in Dutch or Flemish or French, tell us to get out of the way. And Roger turns around, tells the guy to shut up, And then the guy's still drinking all of his beer, and he yells something else, and Roger turns around and pops the guy in the face. And I was like, oh my God. And then all of his friends, who'd also had quite a bit to drink, they're like, hey, that was Roger that just hit you. And then, of course, the guy was Roger worshiping. That was okay that he was bleeding on the lip a little bit. Oh, yeah, Roger. So, anyway, I don't know where that came from.
Dave, I don't know, but
it wasn't. We didn't dominate. It was very much the third moto. Each moto, we did well, and it just, man, oh man, that was a pretty cool. That was a very good experience.
Dave,
but also, living with Roger in 1980, we did win Luxembourg, but if I had to say a year, it was 1980.
Okay. Or was it 81 at the Nations?
81 to Nations and 81 in Europe was Roger's Mechanic. Those are the two.
Okay. You're playing a pretty big role now at the International Motocross Museum that Terry Good's putting together. When did you and Terry first begin to work on that project, and how's it coming along?
coming along really well. I mean, everybody's probably aware he's got the best collection that I mean, it's the best collection worldwide.
Sure.
He's got all these past champions sort of, now buying into, they want their legacy displayed in a certain and represented in a certain way. And so you have, Bob Hanna, Roger, and Joel Robert, and Everett, and Torstein Hallman, and Sylvan Gabors, and just everybody. He's got all the championship equipment and memorabilia. And so right now there was a fundraiser scheduled in July, and it got postponed a couple months.
Yeah.
And I think like every sport or gathering, and this is to try to put our finger in the wind to check industry and interest in this whole thing. And so we're having a fundraising event, and I think it's going to be pretty exciting. I go back and look at, I don't know how long I've been talking to him about it, but just the story of, you made a comment earlier about how much development there went from the early 70s through the mid 80s with lightweight and reed valves and long stroke engines and long travel suspension and compact engine design and increased frame fork, swing arm rigidity, and gas shocks, offset forks, cartridge forks, water cooling, mass centralized, rising rate linkages, power valves, and disc brakes. But every one of those, factories sometimes didn't even come up with all the innovations when you look back at, but, Terry has Kilken's monoshock, and, Terry's got the stories from how so many of those innovations, whether they be upside down forks or cartridge forks, and just a fascinating story, 15-year evolution that was just in hyperspace, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So
Well,
as soon as this virus lets us have our event, I think we're going to be back to hitting the ground running.
I hope so. And, Dave, because I wanted to cover as much as possible about, your early years at Honda, pre-81, I wasn't even able to get to the seasons you saw with Bailey, Johnson, Stanton. You were even there during the McGrath era.
Yeah.
So
that's also one of my my favorite periods, because the Bale thing, and you probably had somewhere you were going, but it got me thinking. The Bale thing, there was so much we didn't want to race against Jean-Michel Bale. Japan didn't want us to take their world champion from Europe to here, but Bale was going to come with or without us. So then he was probably going to ride a Kawasaki, or so then Roger ended up giving Bale his own personal van and buying him a bike or something like, and then, but we had the most stressful period was Ricky Johnson, then he gets injured, but he was the national champion, dominant national champion of the United States, and Jean-Michel Bale, he was the best guy from Europe. And then when Ricky Johnson got hurt, Jeff Stanton stepped up. So you had three riders of world-class aspirations and status and talent and capability, and that was a difficult time, followed by stressful for everybody involved.
Yeah.
And followed by the McGrath era, where we had 3 or 4 champions, but they weren't walking all on top of each other. So you had Jeff Stanton, the more the mature, more the outdoor guy. Jeremy didn't really like outdoor. He didn't want to race outdoor. Yeah. And then he's got all this talent, Southern California, cool, oozing. He rides Supercross with all this VMX influence, scrubbing, and technique that nobody really seen before that. And then you had Doug Henry, kind of in the shadow of McGrath. He was really good at 250 Supercross, but he was, more of an outdoor guy, 125 than 250. And then Steve Lamson. And I remember one of my last years, or my last memories in Honda racing, after so much hate and discontent in the late 80s, then with those champions I just mentioned. Then you had Stanton, McGrath. We were at a track in New York doing a bunch of testing, and the guy had a big pond, and he had a pier, and he had a bunch of fishing equipment. So after testing, all 4 of those guys go down to this pier, and they're down there with fishing poles fishing in this guy's pond. And I was like, this, I've never achieved this. My whole time within Honda, I never got the whole team to hang out next to each other and like each other and go fish together. So
My guest this morning has been Dave Arnold. Dave, with so much going on, I'm going to have you back for a part 2 of this interview at some time. Will you join me again?
Yeah, it'd be great, and it was fun. Thanks for thinking of me and giving me a call.
Thank you so much, Dave. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll speak to you again.
Take care.
Take care, Dave. My guest this morning has been Dave Arnold. I want to thank Dave for his great stories, taking the time to speak to us. Once again, I want to thank our sponsors who help us out with the show every week: Preston Petty Products, The Legend Continues, AMSOIL, the first in synthetic since 1973, Vintco. Keep the ride going. Please join me on Wednesday night for another episode of Vintage Motocross Q&A, and stay tuned here on Vintage Motocross Radio, as I will be bringing you an interview with Jaroslav Falta in the very near future. We're working on that right now. I've been speaking with his daughter, Martina. We're gathering the questions. We have a lot of information from Falta about his early life in Czechia, and we're going to be bringing you that in the very near future. This is Joe Abadi. Thank you for listening to Vintage Motocross Radio. Enjoy the rest of your day.